Ladies and gentlemen, Overgrow Canada with Dana Larson.
Yeah, all right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. And thanks for Lyft for having me here as well. I've been doing a lot of traveling around this year with the Overgrow Canada campaign. We visited 23 cities from Victoria to St. John's and everywhere in between. And we managed to give away over 5 million cannabis seeds, which I'm really happy about. And we got a few more at my booth. If you want to drop by, we can give you a couple. And the point of this campaign and of giving away seeds to people is because I want to live in a country where growing cannabis is normal and it's not a big deal. I want to live in a country where you walk down the street and you see a dozen beautiful flowering cannabis plants in somebody's front yard. You go, wow, those look nice, but you're not freaked out or startled because you've seen dozens of cannabis plants walking down the street that day already. And so my goal is to make the country what I want to see, or to make that reality happen. And so that's why we gave away all these seeds. And it's been remarkably successful. And people are really excited about the opportunity to plant and to get involved in this campaign. And for me, really, as an activist, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, when I've done efforts like Overgrow Canada or the Sensible BC signature gathering campaign we launched in 2013, I meet so many people who thank me for giving them an opportunity to get involved in legalization, and who have wanted to do something and wanted to be involved but didn't know what to do or how to make a difference. And when I tell them, well, you can join our team and collect signatures and talk to people about this, or you can plant some seeds in your community, people are excited to get involved and excited to make a difference. And that, to me, is the most empowering thing. How many Canadians really want to do something about this and recognize how important this issue is, but they don't always know what to do. And the fact is, you can do a lot as an individual to make these laws change. And you can do a great deal in your community just by talking to people or by getting involved in a bigger way, but there's no excuse for not helping to end cannabis prohibition. And I believe that every cannabis user and everybody who has a cannabis business or who is a part of this culture or a part of this movement, it's incumbent on you to remember that this is more than just a business. This is more than just a fun hobby. It's even more than just medicine. It's about people's liberty. It's about people being arrested and imprisoned for what plants they grow in their garden or for what herbal medicines they choose to use. And to me, that is at the core of ending cannabis prohibition, and certainly at the core of my activism. And now, during my tour across Canada, I would give a lecture about the hidden history of cannabis in Canada, and I'm going to give you a shorter version of that talk now, and I'm going to tell you some anecdotes and stories about the last 400 years of the cannabis culture in Canada. And I think that you will agree with me when you've heard my talk and maybe read my book on the history of cannabis in Canada that the leaf on our flag should really be a cannabis leaf, because the cannabis plant has been so much more important to our country's culture, to our society, and to our economy than the maple tree has ever been. And the first cannabis plants in Canada were planted in 1606 in New France, now Nova Scotia, by a man named Louis Hébert. And he was one of the very first colonists to come to Canada. He was a friend of Champlain. He was a herbalist and an apothecary. And he knew very well the medical and industrial and nutritional uses and benefits of cannabis. And in this time, in the 16 and 1700s, cannabis was being grown and used for medicine and for food. But in Europe, most of the cannabis was being grown for fiber, for the British and French navies. And the navies of the world relied on hemp fiber to make all their ropes and all their sails. And these plants were primarily grown in Russia. Russia was the world's basket of cannabis. It was the place where so much was grown. And the reason for that was because at this time, in the 16 and 1700s, industrial cannabis was a very labor-intensive crop. And separating out that inner pulpy mass from the strong outer fibers had to be done manually by hand. And you had to beat the plants and rot them, and it took a lot of effort. And so Russia had the land mass and also the poor peasants who were willing to do this backbreaking labor to process cannabis fiber. And both England and France wanted to break free of dependence on Russian cannabis. So when they looked around the world for new places to grow cannabis, One of those places was Australia. And when England was sending their prisoners to Australia, it was not because their jails were full. That actually makes no sense if you think about it. They were sending prisoners to Australia because they wanted them to work in the Australian cannabis fields. The British government was determined to grow more cannabis somewhere in the world to meet their needs. And they tried desperately in England, and in Australia, and in Canada, under the French administration, and then under the English later. They made every effort for 200 years to bribe and force Canadian farmers to grow more cannabis. But Canadian farmers didn't want to grow cannabis because it was a cash crop, and living in a colony, there isn't a lot of things to spend money on. They wanted to grow food crops so they could survive. And so the French and the British administrators would do all kinds of efforts and subsidies and punishments to force the farmers to grow more cannabis fiber. And you can actually see how strategically important cannabis was if you look at the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812 in Canada. Because at this time, Russia was still the big supplier of cannabis fiber, and when England and Napoleon were at odds with each other, Napoleon signed a treaty with Russia forbidding Russia from trading any hemp fiber with England. It was the only way Napoleon could hope to defeat the British Navy, was to have it run out of sails and ropes in a year or two after being cut off from Russian fiber. And the British would actually capture American ships and force the Americans to go and buy hemp fiber for them from the Russians. But after a couple of years, this was too important for the Russian economy, and so they broke that treaty with Napoleon, and they started selling hemp fiber to England again. And that is why Napoleon invaded Russia in his disastrous winter invasion. It was to cut off the Russian supply of hemp fiber to the British Navy so that he could undermine and ultimately destroy British naval power. And in Canada, in the early 1800s, it was the beginning of what I like to call the golden age of cannabis in Canada. Because finally, in the 1800s, the technology had advanced, and there was enough new immigrants in Canada that it became economical to grow hemp for fiber. And it became, in every province in Canada, cannabis hemp was being grown. The federal government invested heavily in bringing hemp mills and technology from Ireland. They brought in experts from the US, and hemp production was all across the country. And what's even more interesting about the 1800s is not only was cannabis hemp being grown everywhere in Canada, but medical marijuana was becoming more and more widely known and widely used. Now, they weren't calling it marijuana at the time. They were calling it cannabis or hemp. But these products were widely available and widely advertised in Canadian newspapers and magazines and medical journals from the 1850s until around 1930s, when cannabis prohibition really came into place in Canada. And these medicines were very commonly used. They were widely prescribed and discussed in Canadian medical journals. Over 100 scientific studies into the benefits of cannabis medicines were done in North America between 1850 and 1900. It was very, very widely discussed. But they didn't know how cannabis worked. So THC and CBD and all this stuff, that was many, many decades away from being isolated and discovered. So what this meant was that although cannabis was widely used, it was an unreliable medicine, because you would buy a cannabis tincture or extract, and sometimes it might be quite powerful and you might hallucinate or have a really stony experience. Another time you might try something and it might have no effect at all. And this was a problem. And Parke Davis, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, was a big supplier of cannabis medicines, and they would advertise in Canadian medical journals. And Parke Davis said, you can trust the potency and accuracy of our products. And they said, you can trust us because although there is no known chemical test for cannabis potency, at Parke Davis we use a biological test to test cannabis potency. Well, that biological test they were talking about, what it actually meant was they had a lab full of dogs. And these dogs would be dosed with standardized sizes of cannabis extracts, and they would use that information. Somebody's job would be to get the dog to swallow a big pill of cannabis. Then they would write down how long for the dog's tongue to fall out of its mouth, how long till the dog's legs buckle and it falls over and passes out. This was the height of cannabis testing technology in Canada and America from the 1850s until the 1900s. And although I'm not a huge fan of animal testing, if you've got to be one of the animals in the lab that is getting tested on, being the dog that gets super high every day, it's probably the best gig you're going to get. But regardless, these medicines were widely available. There's a wonderful lecture given in 1895 by the head of the Nova Scotia Medical Association. And in this lecture, It sounds like it could have been delivered last week or last month, because in this lecture, he goes over all the different medicinal benefits of cannabis. He talks about smoking cannabis, about eating it, about topical applications. He talks about cannabis for an incredibly wide variety of ailments. He talks about doctor friends of his who are taking enormous doses of cannabis extracts to show their patients how safe it is. And these doctors would describe experiences like noticing that after they'd taken the extract and they looked at their watch, the second hand seemed to take an awfully long time to get around the dial, or the wheels on their carriage seemed to be going very slowly, even though they were traveling at a rapid pace. Those kind of time slow effects that some of you might be familiar with. And he also talks about cannabis to improve your sex life. This doctor says that men who use cannabis extracts will last longer and have more powerful orgasms. He doesn't talk about women's sexuality because it is 1895, but what this lecture shows is that cannabis medicines were being used throughout the 1800s for all the same reasons we use them today, and in all the same ways. They were eating, smoking, applying it topically. They were using it for sexual enhancement, for medical need, for just pleasure and recreation and everything else in between. So how did we get from that golden age of cannabis where these medicines were widely available and widely used and accepted in the mainstream in the 1800s to what we have now with 100 years of drug war and cannabis prohibition? Well, what we call the war on drugs in Canada really began as a war on opium. And that war on opium was really a war on Chinese people who preferred opium to alcohol. And in the early 1900s in Canada, we had a large population of single Chinese men that had come over to Canada to work on the railways and to work in the gold mines. They'd been promised great riches and great wealth, and when they got here, many of them were treated very brutally, and a lot of them died working on these kind of laborious conditions. But these men typically preferred opium to alcohol. And if you go back a few decades, you see that England had actually gone to war with China to force China to take their opium to correct a trade imbalance, because England had found themselves addicted to a Chinese drug that we call tea. And the English were spending so much money buying tea from China that it was about to bankrupt their country. And so they took the opium they were growing in India and they forced the Chinese to take it. They actually went to war with China called the Opium War several times, and ultimately they seized Hong Kong as an opium trading post and forced the Chinese to take British opium. And so a few decades later, when these Chinese men were coming to Canada, they preferred opium to alcohol. And that was actually a rational choice, because these men worked back-breaking physical labor, so having a wonderful pain reliever like opium made a lot of sense. And also a very common ailment at that time was dysentery. Dysentery is basically diarrhea that kills you. And a side effect of opium is constipation. So it actually would save people's lives by helping to stop the dysentery that they were experiencing. But there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in Canada, a lot of outright racism against these men that were here, because they were seen as a challenge to the labor pool. And white unions especially were very upset about the Chinese. They saw them as willing to work for lower wages. And of course they would. They didn't have families to support. They weren't allowed to bring their wives and children over, and they couldn't send money home, so they could work for lower wages than the white men did. There was riots and tension among the white and Chinese communities. And in Vancouver in 1908, there was a big riot. There was a big gathering of the Anti-Asiatic League and the Chinese Exclusion League and groups like that. And they met together in downtown Vancouver, and they stormed into Chinatown. And they beat people up, and they threw rocks through windows, and they lit buildings on fire, and they caused a lot of damage. So the federal government decided to make compensation, and they sent a man over to see what damage had been done and figure out how to compensate the Chinese community. And the man they sent was named William Lyon Mackenzie King. At this time, he was the Deputy Minister of Labor, but he soon became Prime Minister of Canada. Later in his life, Mackenzie King was known for using a Ouija board to talk to his dead dog and his dead mother and get political advice from them. And I guess his dog and his mom hated opium and Chinese people, because Mackenzie King introduced the war on drugs in Canada, and during his leadership of Canada, he really tightened the screws and launched the whole, what we now call the war on drugs. And so when he was in Vancouver to make compensation, he saw those opium dens asking for compensation for the damage that had been done. And on his own initiative, he wrote a report calling for opium to be banned in Canada. This law was passed in a few months with no scientific studies, no sociological evidence, nothing at all but a desire to get rid of Chinese men. And a big part of the law was deportation. After the law was passed, in some communities, 2% of the entire Chinese population was deported in a single year. Many more were arrested and given very severe jail sentences. So the law worked in terms of eliminating and punishing the Chinese community. Now, these laws became more and more strict, and there was actually a racial panic among white Canadians at this time. There was very real fears among the white community that blacks and Chinese were planning to subvert Canadian democracy and take over our country through the use of drugs like opium and cannabis. These fears weren't based in reality, but they were very real fears. They were in the newspapers. There was a popular novel called The Writing on the Wall. It was a best-selling book about a middle-class white couple of bureaucrats in Vancouver who got hooked on opium. And by the end of the book, they've helped to destroy Canadian democracy, and we're all ruled by evil Chinese opium dealers who have taken over Canada, and we're all hooked on their drugs. A very popular book was called The Black Candle by Emily Murphy. I bet you've heard of it. And The Black Candle was serialized in Maclean's magazine. It was a best-selling book. And in The Black Candle, Emily Murphy talked about how the Chinese race didn't even use opium, she said. She reversed history. She said the Chinese are only trying to get white folks hooked on the opium, especially white women, because if they can do that, they can control our society and take over. And in her book, she gave a whole chapter to the chief of police of Los Angeles who talked about the harmful effects of cannabis. And he said that cannabis users become incredibly violent and they are immune to pain. We need extra big bullets to take these guys down because the cannabis makes them so strong. And that parts of in the newspapers would have stories about how parts of the cities, some of the cities in the southern US had so much marijuana violence, the police had to flee, the cities had been taken over, and like a vine crawling up from Mexico, this marijuana was coming into Canada and gonna ruin things for us here. And newspapers through the 20s and 30s had endless scare stories about elementary school children becoming hooked on marijuana, and in their dying breath, they tell their parents how all their friends at school are also marijuana addicts. The stories were laughably ridiculous with what we know now, but these were very real fears. And a lot of Canadians didn't know that marijuana and hashish were the same as hemp and cannabis, and that this was actually all the same thing. Canada passed our first cannabis prohibition law in the 1920s. But I don't think Parliament even knew what they were doing when they passed this law. It was handwritten on one of the documents. Cannabis indica or hashish was added. There was no discussion. We're not even really sure why they passed it, but we think there was a meeting at the UN and that Canada was reacting to that. But the same year Parliament passed this marijuana prohibition, they also passed a law called the Hemp Bounty Act to grow more cannabis in the prairies. So I don't think Parliament even realized that hemp and cannabis and marijuana and hash were all the same thing. But at this time, and in fact, from the 1850s until the 1930s, you could buy pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes in Canadian pharmacies. They were widely advertised and widely used. Most people who used cannabis weren't smoking it, they were taking tinctures and extracts, but pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes were widely sold across Canada in pharmacies from the 1850s until the 1930s. And when Canada first passed this prohibition in the 1920s, it wasn't really enforced, didn't really happen, but then in the 1930s, well actually in the 1920s, we did see one change happen. You know how I told you how cannabis, hemp, and industry was so important in the 1800s, and it was. But by the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, industrial cannabis had fallen out of favor. And it wasn't because of any kind of legal or social reasons, it was because of technology. The cotton engine had been invented, so the cotton gin allowed cotton fibers to be processed much more easily than hemp. And also the steam engine had been invented, so boats didn't need all those sails and all those ropes anymore, and so hemp wasn't so useful. So it had fallen out of favor in the 1890s and 1900s, and also we had all this unlimited supply of trees, and so trees became the source of paper instead of hemp rags and hemp materials like that. But in the 1920s, a new technology was invented and actually perfected in Canada by a farmer named Howard Fraley, and this technology was called the decorticator. And the decorticator was basically a tractor with a machine that would suck out that inner pulpy mass from the hemp fiber. What had used to been back-breaking labor for centuries was now suddenly going to become an incredibly easy process to do. It would take instants to separate out the fibers of this plant. And more interestingly, not only did that mean that you could access those long, strong hemp fibers, but that inner pulpy mass, which had been a waste product for most of hemp's history, could now be saved and used. And this was going to be big news because that inner pulpy mass was a source of biofuel, it was a source of carbohydrates. You could make anything you make from plastic, you could make from hemp, from this inner pulpy mass as well, from the herds. And so we saw headline stories about hemp was about to make a comeback. And the most famous article was in Popular Mechanics magazine in 1938 with the headline saying, "The new billion-dollar crop." That's $1 billion in 1930s money. We're talking trillions of dollars in modern comparison. And the reason it was going to be so valuable was this inner pulpy mass was now going to be available. But the same year that story came out, in 1938, by the end of the year in Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie King passed the first real prohibition on cannabis. And the war on cannabis really began in earnest in Canada. The first thing the RCMP did after Mackenzie King passed the anti-cannabis laws was they went to hemp farmers who were growing cannabis and they burned their fields to the ground. And in the media, these farmers said, "We had no idea we'd been growing a deadly narcotic crop. We thought we were just growing a seed source or a fiber source or a windbreak, and we didn't know." But they burned the fields to the ground. And then the second thing that happened after they legalized, or after they criminalized cannabis, is the RCMP went to the birdseed manufacturers and they forced them to remove hemp seed from their bird seeds. They raided some of them and they arrested them and they forced them. And we know that hemp seed is one of the greatest bird seeds there is, very nutritional for birds and for humans, but they got rid of the bird seed manufacturers having hemp seeds. And the third thing they did after marijuana prohibition passed was they went after those pharmacies and medical marijuana users. The first Canadian that we have a record for being arrested for marijuana possession was an unlucky man named Harry Forbes in Vancouver. And Harry Forbes told the judge that he had bought his pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes at a pharmacy to treat his hay fever. And the judge said that is a deadly narcotic drug and gave him 6 months of hard labor. And the first Canadian we have a record for being arrested for trafficking in marijuana was a pharmacist also selling those same pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes. He told the judge he did not believe cannabis had any narcotic content. He was also convicted and sentenced to prison. So Canada's war on marijuana began with burning hemp fields to the ground, arresting and raiding birdseed manufacturers, and taking marijuana joints out of medical marijuana patients and out of pharmacies. And that began a very dark time for cannabis in Canada. And they changed things a little bit during World War II, which happened a few years later, where they re-legalized hemp in Canada for industrial purposes, for the war effort. In America also, they went through the same cycle. They banned cannabis, and then they re-legalized it again in the US during World War II. In America, they made a film called Hemp for Victory, a propaganda movie about 10 minutes long to encourage American farmers to grow more hemp for the war effort. In fact, even the Nazis recognized the strategic and industrial benefits of cannabis. The Germans put out the Humorous Hemp Primer, a German language, amusing rhyming couplets with male and female rosy-cheeked Aryan cannabis plants on the front, encouraging German farmers to grow more hemp for the fatherland. When World War II ended, cannabis prohibition was put back in place, and that was the end of it until modern times. But something else happened during World War II, and that is that many young Canadian men went overseas. And they went to France and Africa, and while they were fighting and traveling there, they also were exposed to hash and cannabis. And so these young soldiers came back, and they brought knowledge of this plant to the campuses and universities where they went after the war. And they reseeded and relaunched the Canadian cannabis culture. And that movement evolved into the Beat Generation, which evolved into the Yippies and then the Hippies. And by the 1950s and 60s, cannabis use was becoming very widespread in Canada. In fact, in the 1950s, cannabis was already so widespread and so common that Canada's Senate decided to have a special commission to look at why this plant was so popular. Of course, they didn't talk to any cannabis users, but they talked to police, they talked to Harry Anslinger, the famous American prohibitionist, and at the end of their hearings, with the RCMP telling them that cannabis users and opium users are liars and untrustworthy, and they're innately criminals and thieves and all this, at the end of their hearings, they decided to increase the penalties for cannabis to be a 7-year mandatory minimum sentence for importing or cultivation of any quantity of cannabis or opium. One cannabis plant, 7-year mandatory minimum jail sentence. They also passed 6-month mandatory minimum jail sentences for possession of any quantity of cannabis or opium. So this was the hardest laws in Canadian history for cannabis. In fact, the only penalties more strict under the Canadian Criminal Code were treason and first-degree murder. So treason, first-degree murder, growing some cannabis. That's how the law was. And yet, after that law was passed in the 1960s, we saw the greatest increase of cannabis use in Canadian history. So it shows that these laws do not really impact our behavior and choices when it comes to whether we want to use cannabis or not. Facing a 6-month mandatory jail sentence or 7 years in prison minimum, Canadians chose to risk those laws and continue using cannabis in numbers greater than ever before. So by the 1970s, the early 70s, arrests had skyrocketed. They'd gone from a few dozen a year to hundreds a year to thousands to tens of thousands of arrests for cannabis possession every year. And now no longer was it just marginalized Canadians or minority groups. It was mainstream young white Canadians being arrested for cannabis possession. And so in 1970, Pierre Trudeau launched the Ledane Commission, another study to look at the marijuana laws and how to make changes. But unlike the Senate Commission, Ledane actually talked to marijuana users, all kinds of them. And John Lennon and other famous cannabis celebrities also spoke to the commission, and they did some very real research into the effects of cannabis, some very detailed studies. And the Ledane Commission recommended that cannabis be decriminalized so that every Canadian can grow some for themselves and possess it without any penalties, and that more research be done before we move to full legalization. That was 71 years ago. That was 1971, the year I was born. And we're still saying we need more research before we can fully legalize this plant. But it's really one of the most studied and researched plants and medicines in the world. But although the Ledane Commission made some great recommendations, it was basically ignored. Everyone thought in Canada that marijuana was about to be legalized, kind of like now. We had a Trudeau in power promising to change the laws. There was a political consensus. Even in the US, many American states were having referendums and voting to decriminalize cannabis possession and change their laws. Normal Canada was formed in the mid-1970s, and they were so confident marijuana was going to be legalized, they had a legalization victory party. They were only about 50 years too early because they did not change. And then in 1980 in the US, Ronald Reagan was elected, and him and his wife Nancy Reagan relaunched the war on drugs with their Just Say No campaign. And make no mistake, the war on drugs is a very real war with soldiers fighting and killing people in other countries to keep these plant medicines out of North America. And in Canada, we had the election of Brian Mulroney, the first Canadian Prime Minister to use the phrase war on drugs. And in the late 1980s, Brian Mulroney passed some of the world's harshest censorship laws against the cannabis culture. He passed a law called Section 462.2 of the Criminal Code. That law makes everything here illegal, and that law is still on the books in Canada, although it is not generally enforced so heavily as it used to be. But Section 462.2 bans all literature and instruments for illicit drug use. Literature is defined as including Cheech and Chong movies, Grow books, High Times magazine, and me standing here saying medical marijuana is good for you and more Canadians should use it. I just broke Section 462.2, a law which is still on the books across Canada. The law against instruments for illicit drug use includes rolling papers, lighters, anything you find in a store. It's got a Bob Marley poster on the wall, and vaporizers and bongs, and all those things are banned in Canada. And there was a big crackdown in the late 1980s. In fact, the RCMP later said that they had shut down hundreds of head shops just on Yonge Street here alone. Thousands of stores across Canada were either raided or shut down or changed their merchandise to avoid legal penalties. So by the early 1990s, it was very difficult to get a bong or a pipe in Canada. And I know, because I tried. And me and my friends had to smoke out of a Coke can with holes punched in the end of it because it was so hard to get a nice, clean, sterile, safe smoking device. But then we saw in the early 1990s what I consider the rebirth of the Canadian cannabis movement and really the beginning of a civil disobedience campaign that is finally reaching its culmination now these days. And it started largely with Mark Emery in Vancouver, who opened a store called Hemp BC and began selling bongs and pipes in defiance of federal law. And many other stores started opening up across Canada, people doing this in their own communities. And in many ways, it was like the dispensary movement now, just on a smaller scale, because there wasn't as many head shops as there are dispensaries. But it was the same thing we see now, with stores opening across the country, some of them getting raided and shut down, people going to jail for the weekend, losing their livelihood, police throwing boxes of glass bongs into the back of their police trucks where they smashed. In many instances, just like now with dispensaries, the police would not lay charges. No one would get charged, and they would drop all the charges because going to court was too much work. The real penalty was the raid and the seizure and the humiliation and the destruction of your merchandise and harassing your landlord and all that kind of thing. And this went on for several years. But you know what? We won that battle. Enough people opened up bong shops, enough people decided this was simply not, enough the police decided it was not worth the effort to keep going after bong shops for most of Canada. And yet, you probably don't know this, but every year or so, some bong shop still gets raided in Canada. In Kirkland Lake, just a few hours north of here, about, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago, they raided the local bong shops and charged them with trafficking and paraphernalia under Section 462.2. It doesn't happen in big cities so much, except for Winnipeg. Winnipeg seems to love raiding all their local bong shops every 2 years or so. But otherwise, it's mostly small towns. But these laws are still on the books. And although I tell people bongs are illegal, they don't believe me, but they are. And people do get charged for this, but it's one of those laws, just like so many of the cannabis laws now, which is no longer enforced because of our civil disobedience campaign. So that began with bongs and pipes, then it expanded to selling seeds, and Mark Emery was also a leader in that, making seeds available to Canadians. He also made them available to Americans and around the world. Ultimately, that got him a 4.5-year jail sentence in American prisons. But nevertheless, that battle has also largely been won. We still see seed banks getting raided once in a while. The Kingston 420 got raided recently for seeds. It does happen on occasion, but by and large, it's pretty hard to get raided for seeds in Canada these days anymore. Although I am also facing charges for giving away cannabis seeds as part of the Overgrow Canada campaign. I really had to make a big effort to get charged in Calgary, a city that already has 20 places you can buy marijuana seeds over the counter. But last year I was charged and arrested for giving away seeds, and I'm still on bail for that and still have to call my supervisor every couple of weeks. But we basically won the seed battle by and large, and then it was dispensaries opening up. Some of Canada's oldest dispensaries are over 20 years old now. But over the last few years, we've seen this explosion of dispensaries. And although a lot of them get raided, and certainly it looks kind of rough sometimes, at the same time, my understanding is that most dispensaries in Canada that have opened have never been raided. And I think a majority of those that have been raided have reopened, at least a good portion of those that have been raided have reopened again and been able to continue. So I feel even though there's certainly been some people who have had a very difficult situation because of being involved in dispensaries, we're still winning that battle. And we're seeing more and more communities accepting and working with dispensaries and more of that happening. And so what we've evolved into is that the cannabis movement is now Canada's largest ever civil disobedience movement. There's nothing else like this in our history, where you have hundreds of shops across the country and thousands of people involved in changing these laws and making it happen. And that is why we have events like this. That is why we have licensed producers. That is why we are on the verge of legalization. It is not because politicians want to do the right thing. I don't think it's because of lobbyists and politicians or that kind of effort. I believe it is because of this grassroots campaign as the federal government has lost control over cannabis. And the legalization they're trying to bring in is an effort to regain control over this plant. But you know, I've told you the history of cannabis in Canada, but we are making that history now. This story is not yet finished being told. And all of us here in this room have a role to play in changing these laws and ending cannabis prohibition. And I really strongly believe that when we end the war on cannabis and really the greater war on drugs, of which cannabis is kind of the linchpin, it will improve our society and our planet in ways that we can't really even imagine. You know, it feels to us like cannabis prohibition is normal, and that legalization is a strange new experiment that we don't know what's going to happen. But in reality, prohibition is what is abnormal. Prohibition has been a 100-year nightmare for our country. And when we change these laws back to the natural state, I don't like legalization. I will say ending cannabis prohibition. it's going to be very positive for us, like I said, in ways that we can't really see because we're still in the middle of this. But I believe that future generations will look back on the war on drugs the same way we look back on racism and sexism and homophobia, things that we still struggle with, but that we like to think we're more enlightened of a society. We've tried to move past these kind of things. And I believe the war on drugs is of the same ilk and the same kind as those things, and that it's part of the same movement. And I know that these kind of events, a lot of the focus is on making money and how you're going to invest and how you're going to cash in. And hey, I believe in that, and I think it's important to make a living. And I have no ill will against anybody who's working in the cannabis industry at whatever angle. But we have to remember, this is not just about money and profit, especially when there are still people, even in Canada, being arrested every single day for cannabis prohibition. And by and large, those people aren't necessarily in Toronto, although certainly dispensaries are getting hammered pretty hard here. But we live in a big country, and if the further north you go, or the browner your skin is, the more likely you are to face some pretty severe penalties, even for possession of cannabis, even today. And even when we finally get to ending cannabis prohibition in Canada, we're only one small country in the world. And there's people on earth who have their heads chopped off, who go to prison for life, who are tortured and punished in terrible ways, simply because they love cannabis and want to use this plant. And so for me, this is more than money. I certainly make a living off of selling cannabis. I bear no ill will to anybody else who does the same. But it's more than that. It's more than that. And I don't want to live in a country, I don't want to have a dispensary 10 years from now where I'm still selling grams for $5 each. That is not what I want. If that's the case, I will consider my mission a failure. I want my dispensary to go out of business because cannabis is so cheap and so affordable and so plentiful that there's not a lot of money to be made in selling cannabis by the gram to people. That's what I want to see. You know, there's plenty of cash to be made in cannabis, but I want to see it made on a big scale. The last guy was talking about hemp farmers growing it. That to me is the future of legalization. Large scale outdoor cultivation. You won't get a perfectly manicured bud from a farmer growing 1,000 hectares of cannabis, but what you will get is incredibly pure extracts for pennies a gram that can provide incredible medical, social, religious, spiritual, fun benefits of all kinds. And so I see all this effort going into big grow rooms and big industrial houses and that's fine, but that's not the legalization I want to see. And I want to see this available for everybody. And I think it's important to remember that civil disobedience got us here. This is not a time to let the government and big business carry it the rest of the way. This is a time for more civil disobedience, to break those laws even harder than ever before, to use the freedom that we've accomplished to get more freedom from that. You don't give up, you push harder and harder until you get everything you want. And then we keep pushing to make sure that happens not only in Canada, but all around the world. That's my mission. I hope you will join me in that campaign. And starting a cannabis business is a great way to make a difference. But make sure that you be inclusive, that you understand this is not about pitting people against each other. Our movement is about changing these laws so every Canadian can help be part of ending prohibition, so that every Canadian can benefit. And the real financial benefit from cannabis legalization should not be so much from people selling expensive marijuana. It should be from the savings we all have. Instead of having to spend hundreds of dollars a month on our medicine or on our recreation, we can save that money and spend it on other stuff, on housing and food and clothing and the things that we need. That's, to me, the real economic benefit of legalization, and that's what I'm working towards. So thank you for being here and listening to my talk. I've got a booth just over the way. If you like my talk about cannabis history, I've got a whole book on it. I really only touched the surface. It is an amazing story of this plant in our country. I've also got a few other fun books, Harry Pothead and the Marijuana Stone, Green Buds and Hash and the Pie-Eyed Piper, some Weedster fairy tales for all ages. And if you want some cannabis seeds, I've got some of those too, but don't tell the organizers. And otherwise, thank you for having me, and Overgrow Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's give a big hand to Mr. Dana Larson.